We want to bring you the latest developments in the Ethiopian Airlines disaster. This hour, the UK banning the Boeing 737 MAX 8 from its airspace. That could mean big problems for major budget carrier Ryanair. The British Civil Aviation Authority is following earlier moves today by Singapore and Australia. Malaysia as well banning the MAX 8. And this hour, Norwegian Air doing the same and joining the growing list of airlines grounding their fleets of the very popular passenger jet. With Norwegian Air, that brings it up to about 24 airlines that have made that move. Now, Air Canada, WestJet, Sunwing, major U.S. carriers like American, United, and Southwest continue to fly this plane. Boeing is promising quicker action to deal with concerns over the 737 MAX 8s raised by both the Ethiopian Airlines crash and the Lion Air crash last year in October in Indonesia, especially concerns involving the plane's autopilot. The aircraft maker now fast-tracking a software update. The U.S. Federal Aviation Administration says it must be in place by April. Now, that software update, as well as the MAX 8 flight controls and training guidelines, have been in the works since Lion Air's disaster 5 months ago. The first reports from that crash indicate a faulty sensor triggered the MAX 8's autopilot and sent the plane into a fatal nosedive. Now, all of that sets up a very important conversation for you with my next guest. Mary Schiavo is a pilot, former Inspector General of the U.S. Department for Transportation. You heard her on As It Happens last night. Should also mention, just for transparency, she's also an attorney, and she represents families of airline crashes. She does have some current litigation against Boeing. She is in Charleston, South Carolina this morning. Ms. Schiavo, I appreciate your joining us on the network this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
So you gave a lot of very important information yesterday, but it's so wonderful to have you back because so much on this story is changing. Can you come back to the point I was making, the breaking news, the UK now joining Malaysia, Singapore, Australia just this morning? Not necessarily the airlines, but these are countries banning this airplane from their airspace. What does that tell you?
Well, it's just common sense. Let's go back to the very words of the Federal Aviation Administration, which has oversight regulation over Boeing and this airplane. They said after the Lion Air crash and the fixes that Boeing was supposed to make, remember, there was no deadline for them to do that until the second plane went down, the Ethiopian plane, and now Boeing has a deadline of April to get the changes based on the Indonesian crash done. The FAA said without those changes, the plane you could have difficulty controlling the plane, you could have altitude loss, and you may have an impact with terrain. That's the words of the Federal Aviation Administration if you don't make these changes. Now we have a second one. Is it the same as the first one? Well, we already know without the changes you could have an impact with the terrain. So are they telling us that this second one happened while they were waiting around and hadn't given Boeing a deadline? Let's look at it the second way. Now let's suppose it's not the same thing. So we have this open airworthiness directive and Boeing has to make changes by April to avoid an impact with the terrain, and this very plane has a second fatal flaw. Common sense says put them on the ground, let's hear the black box or the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder, figure out what happened on the second plane and give Boeing a deadline.
Literally, as I have been introducing you and you have begun our conversation, we're also hearing that the European Aviation Agency, so we're talking continent-wide, looks to be following the British example. This is growing even as we speak, and yet Canada, the United States, Canadian and American airlines are not taking action. Air Canada continues to maintain these are airworthy. Southwest, for example, Ms. Schiavo saying just this morning it remains confident in the safety and airworthiness of this aircraft. What do they know that the rest of the world doesn't appear to know, or what are they ignoring that the rest of the world is not?
They're ignoring the Federal Aviation Administration, which has already said without changes, the plane could experience, could have experienced difficulty controlling it, altitude loss, and impact with terrain. Issuing a statement like that saying, oh, the planes are safe, when you don't even know why the second one has gone down. You don't even know what's on the black boxes yet, and some of the best black boxes out there. It's incomprehensible. It's crazy.
Well, so what should my country be doing? What should my country be doing today?
They should put them on the ground. It's not going to be very long until they figure this out. The black boxes will have the answers. They're great black boxes, the best there are. It's not going to break any carrier to use other equipment, other planes, until they figure out why a second one went down. And I would say make the changes at the Federal Aviation Administration. Of course, other countries adopt those same regulations. Obviously, the FAA doesn't rule Canada, but Transport Canada does, and adopt the same regulations and get them fixed. Because if they don't, and if there's a third one, this model of airplane is done for. That's it. People will never board it again.
Well, I can imagine there are people having second thoughts strongly already at this time. But can you just want one more question, and I want to have another conversation with you as we watch this on another day. But as I read that statement from Boeing late last night where they said this software enhancement is coming to deploy across the fleet in the coming weeks, and as you've said, by April. They've known about this since the Lion Air crash. There was a patch of some kind, but no deadline. Am I right in interpreting this that it just didn't come out in time for the people on Ethiopian Airlines?
Well, I look at it the other way. Did they really wait for more people to die before they would act? That's what it looks like to me.
Mary Schiavo, let's talk again on this. I really appreciate your expertise, and we'll be continuing to follow along. Thank you very much. From Charleston, South Carolina today, Mary Schiavo, pilot, former Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Transportation.